Hey everyone! With Final Fantasy XIV gaining even more popularity after Shadowbringers, I decided that I wanted to make a video going over the very basics of the game's 3 roles for folks who may have had some anxiety with them. I won't be going deep into specific classes, that's not really what this video's for, but I do want to give folks an idea of what they're signing up for when they go to specific roles, and also help alleviate some of the more common concerns. So with that said, we'll start out with what's possibly the most common role. DPS. DPS is the common term for damage dealing classes, known by their red class icons and the acronym meaning damage per second, and they're the ones responsible for making sure they hit other things while not getting hit themselves. There is more to it, but that's basically it. In fact, a lot of these tips can be applied to other roles as well, from any of the 3 I'm about to say, but as with anything, there are certain things that they have to focus on more. And those are what I'm going to try to focus on for each role. As a DPS, your job is to deal as much damage as possible, and a lot of the learning curve for DPS classes is finding out how to do all the mechanics of a fight correctly to not die while also dealing the most damage that you can. The individual DPS classes have a lot of variance with how they play, which makes learning new classes a lot of fun. But there are a few common threads between them, such as our first point, always be using skills. A lot of the folks I see starting the game will spend a lot of their time trying to figure out what skill should I use right now. If you're new to the game, this can seem daunting, but pressing any button to deal damage is better than pressing none. You can use abilities about every 2.5 seconds, so any time in between those 2.5 seconds is a loss of damage, or downtime. The amount of time you're using your skills without gaps in between is called uptime, and proper uptime is one of the biggest pieces of being a good DPS. And now that you're pressing buttons all the time, it brings me right to my second point. Learning your skill rotation. For each class, there's a broadly defined, correct sequence of buttons to press that's known as your rotation. For some classes, like tanks and melee DPS, this is indicated by performing combos that lead one ability into another. For magic dealing classes, or ranged classes, it's often a bit less well defined, but by using your skills in the correct order, it'll mean a significant boost to how much damage you deal. For example, black mages will have fire and ice phases that are used to deal damage and regenerate mana respectively, and switching between them is core to the class. With that said, once you're using the right abilities in the right order, there is one more thing that you do have to keep in mind that some folks seem to forget sometimes, and that is, you can't deal damage if you're dead. As much as you're now focusing on pressing all your buttons correctly, you can definitely get a sense of tunnel vision, which is a problem when those big red areas come to call and you're left taking damage you could have avoided. Being dead not only means you're missing uptime, it means that when you come back, you're going to have a debuff that makes you deal less damage for 2 full minutes after your revival, which can be quite a while in fights. So as tempting as it is to stand in place and let the healer handle the damage you take, avoiding the big red circles is almost always the correct decision. Learn your skills, learn what they do, and make sure things die as quickly as possible. Every second that an enemy is dead is another second that your tank and healer don't have to deal with the damage they put out. But to know how to deal with the damage they deal, let's turn to our second role, tanks. With the big health pools and the blue icons, tanks are the classes responsible for getting hit and then hitting back. As a tank, your job is to keep the damage pointed away from your allies and the enemies in a big ball to get hit by your DPS. To that end, there are a couple things you can do to make yourself an even better damage sponge. Like our first point, use your cooldowns. Cooldowns is usually used as a shorthand in this context for tank abilities that reduce damage. When you pull a big group of enemies with you, using your tank abilities to reduce the amount of damage you take is pretty much your job. You use your big area of effect or AoE abilities to make everything mad at you specifically. From there, you stagger those damage-reducing buttons to try and take consistently less damage over time. Pressing every button at once is tempting, but if those enemies are still alive after the effects expire, the next thing that expires will probably be you. And before we move to point 2, a small disclaimer. As the folks that charge in first, and the ones that position the enemies, tanks are often expected to be the leaders of the group. There's an unspoken rule that you'll know the mechanics of the fight, the dungeons, the bosses. So with that, point 2, ask for help. There are a lot of toxic online communities. I know, you know, it's pretty much unavoidable at this point. But among all the ones I've been in, Final Fantasy XIV is one of the most open and welcoming. If it's your first time in a dungeon, your first time in a boss, you just don't feel like you remember something you've seen there before, don't hesitate to let people know. As a healer or a DPS, seeing my tank say, "It's my first time here," means not that it's time to leave, but that it's time to help them out and be patient as they learn new things. Similarly, but not identical, for some later fights in the game, there are a lot of mechanics that can hit the entire team if not handled properly. So for the more difficult content, it's typically seen as polite to watch a video explaining what you should do before you go into the fight, so you'll have a baseline idea of what to expect. Going into easier fights, like story fights, blind is usually fine though. Just let your team know that it's your first time or that you're blind on it. And if someone has a problem with that, know that they're the exception, not the rule. And ultimately, the sub-goal of the tank brings us back to our third point: deal as much damage as you can. I know, you're here to take damage and make sure your team stays alive, but as I briefly went over in the earlier DPS section, nothing can deal damage if it's dead. The sooner the enemies die, the less damage you take, which means that that's what you want to do. The sooner the boss dies, the less damage you take, so that's what you want to do. Once you've learned to stay alive, your next job is to be a DPS with a blue icon. Stay safe, but be strong. And to finish things up, our final class. Healers. When health bars go down, you bring them back up. The green icon jobs with control over life and death are the healers. It's your responsibility to make sure your crew makes it through the fight. So on that note, here's what you need to know. Learn your healing skills. Your healing isn't only limited to the skills you can cast on the 2.5 second global cooldown we went over with the DPS earlier. Global here means that any ability on this cooldown will go on that 2.5 seconds whenever you use any of the abilities on it. But there are healing abilities off of that cooldown, like Lustrate, Benediction, Essential Dignity, and others, that will help you put out more healing in times that you really need it. Knowing what buttons you can press when you're panicking because your tank just had all their blood punched out can be an absolute lifesaver, literally and figuratively. With that said, it brings me to point number 2. Watch your mana. The healer is one of the few classes that I'd say you actively have to watch your mana for. Using a raise spell to get somebody back up if they die is nearly a quarter of your total mana. And while you do have tools to get that mana back, realizing you're running on empty in the middle of a fight is never a fun moment. So, don't use a larger heal when a smaller one will do. Be frugal. Any healing that you do that goes over max HP doesn't help much. For now anyway. Square Enix, call me, I have ideas about Chemist. That aside, let's go to our last point. The only point of HP that matters is the last one. Did they die? No? Then you did your job. Whether it's by 10 HP or 10,000, if they're not dead, you're fine. As a new healer, you'll probably keep most people topped off all the time because that's what you're comfortable with. But if no one's in danger of dying, you're always free to do damage yourself. By level 50, each healer gets an incredibly good attack that can hit multiple enemies in an area of effect. In dungeons, once you're comfortable keeping the tank alive, deal some extra damage. You don't have to do it right away, but as I've said at least twice now, the sooner the enemies die, the less damage your party takes, the easier it is for you. Once you've learned to keep others alive, your next job is to be a DPS with a green icon. Keep them safe, but be strong. Again, these are the very basics for all of the roles, but thank you for watching, and I hope that if you're having a little bit of difficulty approaching one of these roles, this might give you a basic framework to work off of. There are more comprehensive guides for the individual classes, both in video and in text-based forms, that can give you a better idea of what individual jobs will be able to do, but ultimately just find one that feels right for you. They're going to take a little bit of practice, but if you like a job, go for it. If you like the aesthetics of a job, same. And ultimately, more than anything else, if you're not really having fun with it, try something else. This is a game, and you're here to have fun, so don't stick with something that you don't like just because you think it would be better or optimal. There's no shortage of people doing different jobs and using different kinds of roles. So find what makes you happy. Play that. Anyway, thanks for watching, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all around. Take easy.